The sun hung low over the dusty town of Redemption Creek, casting long shadows across the weathered boardwalks and painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson. Miles Blackwood sat motionless atop his dappled stallion, his weathered face betraying nothing of the storm that raged within him. At 45, the former Texas Ranger carried the weight of his years in the deep lines etched around his eyes and the silver streaking his once dark hair. His reputation preceded him throughout the territories, a man not to be crossed, a legend with a gun whose mere presence could empty a saloon faster than a rattlesnake on a dance floor. He'd come to this forgotten corner of Colorado with a singular purpose: to find Elijah Hammond, the man who'd murdered his brother and stolen everything that mattered. For 3 long years, Miles had followed a trail gone cold more times than he cared to count. Now, as he studied the town before him, something told him his hunt was nearing its end. His hand unconsciously drifted to the worn walnut grip of his Colt Peacemaker as he nudged his horse forward, the animal's hooves kicking up small clouds of dust that seemed to disappear into the dying light. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from today? I'd love to know what town or city you're tuning in from. The main street of Redemption Creek was like 100 others Miles had passed through, a jumble of false-fronted buildings, a general store with barrels out front, and the inevitable saloon where men sought to drown memories best forgotten. The Golden Nugget Saloon stood as the crown jewel of the town, its windows glowing with warm light that spilled onto the street as piano music drifted through the swinging doors. Inside, Elizabeth Spencer moved efficiently behind the bar, her honey blonde hair swept up in a practical style that did little to diminish her natural beauty. At 28, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with her surroundings, a quality that hadn't gone unnoticed by the men who frequented the establishment. What they didn't know was that Elizabeth owned the place, having inherited it from her father 6 months prior, along with a mountain of debt and troubles that seemed to grow with each passing day. Chief among those troubles was Elijah Hammond, the local cattle baron who'd set his sights on acquiring the saloon, and Elizabeth, by any means necessary. Hammond had already bought the bank that held her mortgage and made it clear that her options were running out. She could marry him or watch as everything her father had built was torn down board by board. The saloon fell silent as Miles pushed through the batwing doors, his spurs jingling with each measured step. Every eye in the place turned to the stranger, taking in the trail dust on his long coat, the twin Colts hanging low on his hips, and the hard set of his jaw. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine as their eyes met across the room. There was something dangerous yet compelling in his gaze, a depth of purpose she'd rarely encountered. Without breaking eye contact, she reached for a glass and poured a whiskey, sliding it across the polished wood as he approached. "Welcome to the Golden Nugget, stranger," she said, her voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. "First drinks on the house." Miles nodded his thanks, downing the amber liquid in one swift motion before setting the glass down. "I'm looking for a man named Elijah Hammond," he said, his voice low and graveled from disuse. The silence in the room deepened, and Elizabeth's fingers tightened around the edge of the bar as she fought to maintain her composure. "Mr. Hammond owns most of the valley," she replied carefully. "You'll find him at the White Oak Ranch, about 3 miles north of town." Something flickered in Miles' eyes, Satisfaction, perhaps, or the cold determination of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. Word traveled fast in a town like Redemption Creek. By sunset the following day, everyone knew that the stranger was Miles Blackwood and that he was hunting Elijah Hammond. Elizabeth had heard the whispers. The stories of how Hammond had fled Texas after killing a man named Thomas Blackwood in a land dispute, stealing not only his life, but the deed to his ranch as well. Some said it had been a fair fight. Others claimed Thomas had been shot in the back while reaching for a bottle, not a gun. Whatever the truth, the arrival of the dead man's brother sent ripples of unease throughout the community. Hammond's men were everywhere, watching, waiting for the inevitable confrontation between the two men. Elizabeth found herself caught in the middle, knowing that whichever way the wind blew, her future and that of the saloon hung in the balance. That evening, as she closed up for the night, a shadow fell across the doorway. She looked up to find Miles standing there, hat in hand, a question in his eyes. "Miss Spencer, I wonder if I might have a word?" he asked, and something in his tone made it impossible to refuse. They sat at a corner table, the empty saloon eerily quiet, without its usual cacophony of voices, clinking glasses, and piano music. Miles spoke little of himself, instead asking questions about Hammond, about his ranch, his men, and his standing in the community. Elizabeth found herself revealing more than she'd intended. Her father's debts, Hammond's pressure to marry him, the impossible position she found herself in. "He's hosting a gathering tomorrow night," she explained, twisting the simple band that had been her mother's around her finger. "Some kind of celebration for the railroad contract he just secured. Everyone who's anyone in the territory will be there." Miles leaned back, his eyes calculating as he absorbed this information. "And you?" he asked quietly. "Will you be attending this gathering?" Elizabeth nodded, a resigned smile touching her lips. "Mr. Hammond has made it clear my presence is required. He intends to announce our engagement, whether I've agreed to it or not." Something dangerous flashed in Miles' eyes then, a barely contained fury that should have frightened her, but instead kindled something warm in her chest, the first spark of hope she'd felt in months. "Perhaps," he said, his voice like gravel over steel, "we might find a way to help each other, Miss Spencer." The White Oak Ranch sprawled across the valley like a kingdom, its main house rising from the landscape like a declaration of Elijah Hammond's power and wealth. Carriages lined the circular drive as the territory's elite arrived for what promised to be the social event of the season. Miles adjusted his borrowed suit, uncomfortable in the formal attire, but understanding its necessity. Beside him, Elizabeth sat rigidly in the buggy, her blue silk dress a stark contrast to her pale complexion. "Remember," he said quietly as they approached, "stay close to me, no matter what happens." She nodded, her hands clutched tightly in her lap, the leather gloves hiding her trembling fingers. The plan they'd devised was dangerous, perhaps foolhardy, but it offered them both a chance at what they needed. For Miles, justice. For Elizabeth, freedom. As they entered the grand foyer, Hammond himself came forward to greet them, his smile faltering only slightly at the sight of Elizabeth's companion. "Miss Spencer," he said, taking her gloved hand and bringing it to his lips. "I was beginning to fear you wouldn't join us tonight." His gaze shifted to Miles, recognition and confusion warring in his eyes. "And you've brought a guest." Elijah Hammond was a man in his early 50s with silver-streaked dark hair and the robust physique of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted in life. Recognition dawned slowly in his eyes as he studied Miles' face, and Elizabeth could feel the tension between the two men building like a summer storm. "Blackwood," Hammond said finally, his voice betraying nothing of the alarm he must have felt. "It's been a long time." Miles' smile never reached his eyes. "Not long enough for some, I imagine." The two men stared at each other, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air between them. Hammond was the first to break the silence, turning to Elizabeth with a forced smile. "My dear, I believe the musicians are ready. Our guests are expecting the first dance." He extended his arm, but Elizabeth remained rooted in place, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Actually," Miles interjected smoothly, "Miss Spencer has promised this dance to me." The look that passed between the men spoke volumes, a silent battle of wills that ended when Hammond stepped back with a tight nod. "Of course," he said, his voice brittle. "But do remember, I've planned a special announcement for later this evening." As the orchestra struck up a waltz, Miles led Elizabeth onto the dance floor, one hand resting lightly at her waist, while the other clasped her trembling fingers. "He knows who you are," she whispered, trying to keep her expression neutral as they moved through the steps. "He'll have his men watching your every move." Miles guided her through a turn, his movements surprisingly graceful for a man more at home in a saddle than a ballroom. "Let them watch," he replied, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "It changes nothing." As they danced, Elizabeth became aware of the stares and whispers that followed them across the floor. She could feel Hammond's gaze burning into her back, could sense the gathering storm that threatened to break over them all. When the music ended, Miles escorted her to the edge of the room, keeping her hand firmly tucked in the crook of his arm. "Stay within sight," he murmured, as a server approached with champagne. "Things are about to get interesting." Before she could ask what he meant, Hammond's voice boomed across the room, calling for his guests' attention. "Friends, neighbors, distinguished guests," Hammond began, raising his glass as he stood on the small dais where the orchestra was arranged. "I've brought you here tonight not only to celebrate the railroad's arrival in our valley, but to share some personal news as well." His gaze found Elizabeth in the crowd, his smile like that of a predator. "Miss Elizabeth Spencer has done me the great honor of agreeing to become my wife." A murmur rippled through the assembled guests as all eyes turned to Elizabeth, whose face had drained of color. Before she could speak, Miles stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his hand coming to rest casually near his concealed pistol. "Miss Spencer can't possibly marry you, Hammond." The cattle baron's face darkened with anger. "And why is that, Blackwood?" Miles' smile was cold as winter. "Because she's already married." He turned to Elizabeth, whose shocked expression was entirely genuine. "Isn't that right, Mrs. Blackwood?" The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Hammond's champagne glass shattering on the floor. Chaos erupted in the grand ballroom, with guests murmuring and pointing as Hammond's face contorted with rage. "This is preposterous," he sputtered, gesturing wildly. "There's been no wedding, no announcement. This is nothing but a desperate lie." Miles stood his ground, one hand protectively at Elizabeth's elbow. "We were married by Judge Wilson yesterday afternoon," he stated calmly, referencing the territorial judge who'd conveniently left town that morning. "It was a private ceremony, owing to the hasty nature of our union." His implication hung in the air, causing several of the society matrons to gasp and fan themselves vigorously. Elizabeth fought to keep her expression composed, though her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. This hadn't been part of their plan. A diversion, yes, but nothing so permanent or public as a false claim of marriage. Yet, as she looked at Hammond's thunderous expression, she understood Miles' strategy. A single woman could be coerced or threatened, but a married one, especially one wed to a man of Miles Blackwood's reputation, was another matter entirely. Hammond stepped down from the dais, his movements deliberate as he approached them. "I don't believe you," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "and I don't take kindly to having what's mine stolen from under my nose." Miles met Hammond's gaze unflinchingly. "She was never yours to begin with, Hammond, much like my brother's ranch wasn't yours to take." The tension in the room thickened as understanding dawned on the assembled guests. This wasn't merely about Elizabeth, but about a blood debt long overdue. Hammond's hand moved toward his jacket, where Elizabeth suspected he carried a derringer or small pistol. "I suggest," Miles continued, his voice carrying easily through the hushed room, "that you congratulate us on our union and bid us good evening. Any other course of action would be unfortunate." The two men stood locked in silent combat for what seemed an eternity before Hammond finally inclined his head in a mockery of civility. "My congratulations, then," he said, his words dripping with venom, "though I wonder if the bride knows what kind of man she shackled herself to." He turned to Elizabeth, his eyes cold. "Did he tell you how many men he's killed, my dear? How many widows he's created? Or did he just tell you he could protect you from me?" Miles's arm tightened around Elizabeth's waist as he guided her toward the door. "We'll be taking our leave now," he announced, his eyes never leaving Hammond. "Much obliged for the hospitality." The ride back to town passed in tense silence, the only sound the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves and the distant rumble of thunder heralding an approaching storm. Elizabeth sat rigidly beside Miles, her mind racing through the implications of what had just transpired. "That wasn't the plan," she finally said as the lights of Redemption Creek came into view. "You were supposed to create a distraction so I could search his study for the deed to your brother's ranch, not announce to half the territory that we're married." Miles kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. "Plans change," he replied simply. "Hammond's not a fool. He'd have suspected something if we'd both disappeared from the party at the same time." He glanced at her then, his gaze softening slightly. "Besides, being known as my wife gives you protection. No man in the territory will trouble you now, at least until this business with Hammond is settled." Elizabeth's laugh held no humor. "And then what?" she demanded. "Once you've gotten what you came for, once you've had your revenge, what happens to me? Do I become a widow, or just a woman abandoned by a husband who never truly existed?" The questions hung between them, unanswered, as they pulled up in front of the Golden Nugget Saloon. The saloon was closed for the evening, the darkened windows reflecting the first fat drops of rain that had begun to fall. Miles helped Elizabeth down from the buggy, his hand lingering at her waist longer than necessary. "You should pack your things," he said as he tethered the horse. "Hammond won't take kindly to being humiliated in front of the entire county. He'll be coming for both of us now." Elizabeth unlocked the saloon's side door, stepping into the familiar, comforting darkness. "This is my home," she said simply, lighting a lamp that cast long shadows across the empty room. "I'm not running." Miles followed her inside, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair in frustration. "Elizabeth, be reasonable. The man's dangerous." She whirled to face him, her eyes flashing with a fire he hadn't seen before. "And you're not?" she challenged. "The legendary Miles Blackwood, who's tracked a man across 3 states for 3 years? You think I don't know what I've gotten myself into?" They stood facing each other in the lamplight, the air between them charged with something neither was ready to name. Finally, Miles nodded, a reluctant respect in his eyes. "All right," he said quietly, "but we do this my way. And the first sign of trouble, you leave town, with or without me." The rain fell in earnest now, drumming against the roof and windows as Elizabeth moved about her quarters above the saloon, changing from her fine silk dress into more practical attire. Miles had taken up position by the window, watching the empty street below with the vigilance of a man who'd survived by anticipating trouble. "Hammond will send men tonight," he said without turning. "Probably Jensen and that Mexican gunslinger he keeps on his payroll. They'll want to send a message." Elizabeth's hands stilled as she braided her hair. "What kind of message?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Miles finally turned to look at her, his expression grave in the soft lamplight. "The kind meant to frighten you into submission. The kind that leaves marks." His honesty, brutal as it was, confirmed what she'd always known about Elijah Hammond. Beneath the veneer of civilization beat the heart of a tyrant. "Then we'll be ready for them," she said, moving to a small chest in the corner. She removed a key from around her neck and unlocked it, revealing a shotgun nestled atop a bundle of letters. "My father believed a woman should know how to protect herself," she explained, checking that the weapon was loaded. Something like approval flickered in Miles' eyes as he watched her handle the shotgun with practiced ease. They waited as the hours crept by, the storm intensifying until it seemed the very building shook with each clap of thunder. Elizabeth had dozed off in the armchair by the small fireplace, exhaustion finally claiming her despite her determination to remain alert. Miles watched her from his position by the window, studying the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the way the firelight played across her features. In sleep, the worry lines that bracketed her mouth softened, making her appear younger, more vulnerable. He found himself wondering what her life might have been like in different circumstances. If her father had lived, if Hammond hadn't set his sights on her, if Miles himself hadn't dragged her into his quest for vengeance. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He'd spent 3 years consumed by the need to make Hammond pay for what he'd done, never considering what would come after. Now, looking at Elizabeth, he found himself thinking of possibilities he'd long since abandoned. A home, a life beyond the endless pursuit of justice. A sudden movement in the street below snapped him back to attention. 2 riders approached slowly through the rain, their slickers glistening wetly in the faint light from the hotel across the way. "Elizabeth," he called softly, reaching for his Colt. "They're here." The knock, when it came, was almost polite. 3 measured raps that belied the violence of the men who stood on the other side of the door. Elizabeth took position behind the bar, shotgun at the ready, while Miles moved silently to stand beside the door. "Miss Spencer," called a voice she recognized as belonging to Jensen, Hammond's foreman. "Mr. Hammond requests a word." Miles caught her eye, giving a slight nod. They'd discussed this possibility. Better to let the men enter than to have them break down the door. "The door's unlocked," she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I've nothing to say to Mr. Hammond or his men." The door swung open slowly, and Jensen stepped inside, water dripping from his slicker onto the wooden floor. Behind him came Diaz, Hammond's hired gun, his hand resting casually near the revolver at his hip. Both men pulled up short at the sight of Elizabeth behind the bar, the shotgun aimed squarely at Jensen's chest. "That's far enough, gentlemen," she said, her finger steady on the trigger. Before either man could respond, the door swung shut behind them with a decisive click, and they turned to find themselves staring down the barrel of Miles Blackwood's Colt. "Evening, boys," Miles drawled, his expression coldly amused as the color drained from Jensen's face. "Mighty late for a social call." Diaz's hand twitched toward his gun, but Miles shook his head slowly. "I wouldn't," he advised. "Miss Spencer there is quite handy with that scattergun, and at this range, she'd cut you clean in half before you cleared leather." Jensen raised his hand slightly, palms out in a placating gesture. "Now, Blackwood, there's no need for this to get ugly. Mr. Hammond just wants to talk things through, reasonable-like." Miles' laugh held no humor. "Reasonable isn't exactly Hammond's style, as I recall. Last time we had a disagreement, my brother ended up with a bullet in his back." He motioned with his pistol toward the center of the room. "Move away from the door, both of you." As the men complied, Elizabeth circled out from behind the bar, keeping the shotgun trained on them. "What's Hammond's message?" she demanded, her voice hard. Jensen glanced from her to Miles and back again, clearly reassessing the situation. "He says you have until noon tomorrow to reconsider this arrangement. Come to White Oak alone, and all debts will be forgiven. Stay with Blackwood, and he can't guarantee the safety of anyone in this town who does business with you." The threat hung in the air like smoke, its implications clear to everyone in the room. Hammond was declaring war, not just on Miles and Elizabeth, but on anyone who sided with them. "That's mighty generous of him," Miles remarked, his tone conversational, even as his eyes remained hard as flint. "But I have a counteroffer." With a speed that belied his casual stance, he surged forward, bringing the butt of his pistol down hard against Jensen's temple. The foreman crumpled without a sound, leaving a startled Diaz facing Miles alone. "Tell Hammond, I'm coming for what's mine, the deed to my brother's ranch and justice for his murder. Tell him if he touches one hair on Elizabeth's head, what I'll do to him will make hell seem like a mercy." Diaz swallowed visibly, but held his ground. "You're a dead man, Blackwood," he said quietly. "Hammond has 20 men who will hunt you down like a dog." Miles smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Then he'd better send all 20 at once," he replied, opening the door and gesturing for Diaz to drag Jensen out into the rain. "Because anything less won't be enough." Once the men had gone, Elizabeth sagged against the bar, the adrenaline that had kept her upright suddenly deserting her. Miles moved to her side, gently taking the shotgun from her trembling hands. "You did well," he said quietly, his hand warm against her shoulder. She looked up at him, seeing beyond the hardened gunfighter to the man beneath, a man who'd carried grief and rage for 3 long years, whose quest for vengeance had hollowed him out and filled the space with something cold and unyielding. "What happens now?" she asked, knowing that Hammond would never let either of them live in peace. Miles' expression softened slightly as he looked down at her, something like regret flickering in his eyes. "Now," he said, "we prepare for war." Outside, the storm raged on, lightning illuminating the empty street in brief, harsh flashes. In the distance, the retreating figures of Jensen and Diaz disappeared into the darkness, carrying with them a message that would set into motion events that could only end in blood. Elizabeth shivered, not from cold, but from the certainty that by morning, Redemption Creek would become a battlefield, and she and Miles were standing squarely in Hammond's crosshairs. The dawn broke clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean sometime in the early hours. Elizabeth moved quietly around her small kitchen, preparing coffee and a simple breakfast as Miles studied a rough map of Hammond's ranch he'd drawn from memory. They'd spent much of the night planning, arguing, and finally coming to an uneasy compromise. Miles would confront Hammond, but not alone as he'd initially insisted. Elizabeth knew the layout of White Oak better than he did, having attended numerous gatherings there over the past 6 months. Together, they stood a better chance of retrieving the stolen deed and escaping with their lives. Hammond keeps his important papers in a safe behind the painting in his study, she explained, setting a steaming mug before him. I've seen him open it. Right 3 times, left twice, right once. Miles looked up at her with new appreciation. You're observant, he remarked, adding her information to his notes. Elizabeth shrugged, taking a seat across from him. When you're a woman alone in this world, you learn to pay attention to details. They can mean the difference between surviving and... She didn't finish the thought. But she didn't need to. Miles reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers in a rare gesture of tenderness. You won't be alone anymore, he said, the words falling between them like a promise neither had anticipated. The sound of horses in the street below interrupted the moment. Miles was on his feet instantly, peering through the curtains with his hand on his pistol. Townspeople, he reported after a moment, gathering in front of the saloon. Elizabeth joined him at the window, frowning as she recognized several of Redemption Creek's prominent citizens. The mayor, the blacksmith, Dr. Wilson, and others, all looking grim in the early morning light. They're afraid, she murmured, understanding immediately. Hammond's threat has them scared. Miles nodded, his expression hardening. They want us gone, he said simply. Can't say I blame them. Before Elizabeth could respond, a knock sounded at the door downstairs. They exchanged a glance, and she saw in his eyes what he was thinking, that this was his fight, not hers or the town's, that perhaps it would be better if he simply rode out and faced Hammond alone, drawing the danger away from Redemption Creek. Don't, she said sharply. Don't you dare start thinking nobly now, Miles Blackwood. We're in this together. His surprise at her vehemence gave way to a reluctant smile. Yes, ma'am, he replied, the ghost of humor touching his eyes for the first time since she'd met him. Together it is. Mayor Fletcher was a corpulent man with nervous hands and a politician's ability to speak without saying much of consequence. He stood in the center of the saloon, hat clutched to his chest, as a delegation of concerned citizens arrayed themselves behind him like a Greek chorus. Miss Spencer, or, Mrs. Blackwood, as we understand the situation now stands, he began, his gaze darting between Elizabeth and Miles. We've come to express our concern about recent developments. Miles leaned against the bar, his posture deceptively relaxed, while his eyes remained vigilant. Developments, he repeated flatly. You mean Hammond's threat to ruin anyone in town who does business with my wife? The mayor cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with Miles's directness. Mr. Hammond is an important man in this territory, he hedged. He employs half the county, bankrolls the new schoolhouse, and has considerable influence with the territorial governor. Elizabeth stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. And that gives him the right to threaten innocent townspeople? To demand I marry him or lose everything my father built? Dr. Wilson, a graying man who treated Elizabeth's father in his final illness, spoke up. No one's saying that's right, Elizabeth. But we have families to consider, livelihoods at stake. The unspoken request hung in the air. Leave town, spare us from Hammond's wrath. Take your troubles elsewhere. Elizabeth felt a wave of betrayal wash over her as she looked at these people, many of whom she'd known all her life. They'd watched her grow up, had attended her parents' funerals, had lifted glasses in this very saloon to toast both joyous occasions and solemn ones. Now they stood before her, asking her to sacrifice herself for their peace of mind. My father built this saloon when Redemption Creek was nothing but a few tents and hopeful miners, she said, her voice tight with emotion. He believed in this town when no one else did. And now you're asking me to abandon it because Elijah Hammond has you all too terrified to stand up for what's right? The blacksmith, a mountain of a man named Hargrove, stepped forward. It ain't about right or wrong, Miss Elizabeth. It's about survival. Hammond's threatened to cut off water rights to anyone who stands with you. Without water, there ain't no crops, no cattle, no town. Miles straightened, his hand coming to rest protectively at Elizabeth's back. And if you give in now, he said quietly, what's to stop Hammond from making more demands tomorrow or the day after? Men like him don't stop taking just because you give them what they want. A heavy silence fell over the gathering as the townspeople exchanged uncomfortable glances. It was the widow Cooper who finally broke it, stepping forward from the back of the group. Her husband had owned the general store until his death the previous winter, leaving her to run the business alone. Mr. Blackwood's right, she said, firmly. I remember when my Herbert stood up to Hammond over water rights 3 years ago. Hammond didn't just take our northern pasture. He poisoned our well for good measure, killed 2 good milk cows. She turned to face her neighbors. We give in now. We might as well hand over the deed to the entire town. Her words seemed to strike a chord, and Elizabeth watched as resolve began to replace fear in some of the gathered faces. Mayor Fletcher, sensing the shift in sentiment, raised his hands placatingly. Now let's not be hasty. Perhaps there's a compromise to be reached. Miles cut him off with a sharp laugh. There's no compromising with a snake, Mayor. You either cut off its head or you get bit. He addressed the crowd directly, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through years of wearing a badge. Hammond sent men to threaten my wife last night. At noon today, he expects her to come crawling to him, begging forgiveness. Instead, I'll be paying him a visit to reclaim property he stole and to answer for a murder he committed. Any man willing to stand with us is welcome. Any who aren't, I suggest you stay clear of White Oak Ranch this afternoon. The crowd dispersed shortly after, some with promises of support, others with murmured apologies and downcast eyes. When the last of them had gone, Elizabeth turned to Miles, a question in her eyes. You're still planning to go alone, aren't you, despite everything we discussed last night? Miles sighed, leaning heavily against the bar. Hammond will have his men positioned all over that ranch, he said. It's not just about the deed anymore, Elizabeth. It's about making a stand, here and now, or running forever. He reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture startlingly intimate. And I'm tired of running. Elizabeth caught his hand, holding it against her cheek. Then we face him together, she insisted. "You need someone who knows the house, who can get to the safe while you keep Hammond occupied." Miles looked as though he wanted to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. Instead, he nodded, a reluctant smile touching his lips. "Stubborn woman," he murmured. But there was admiration in his tone. "If we're going to do this, we'll need help. Someone Hammond won't suspect." Elizabeth smiled, an idea already forming. "I know just the person," she said. "Hammond's cook, Sarah. She's been slipping me information for months. Her sister worked at your brother's ranch before Hammond took it over." The plan they devised was dangerous, fraught with potential disaster, but it was the best chance they had. Sarah, the cook at White Oak Ranch, had agreed to help them gain access to the house during the confusion of the noon confrontation. Elizabeth would slip in through the kitchen while Miles faced Hammond in the front yard, drawing attention away from the main house. If all went well, she would retrieve the deed from the safe and rendezvous with Miles at the old miller's cabin a mile from the ranch. If things went wrong, neither of them dwelled on that possibility. As the morning wore on, unexpected allies appeared at the saloon. Hargrove the blacksmith arrived with a rifle and a grim expression. The Cooper widow brought ammunition and bandages. Even young Billy from the livery stable showed up, insisting he knew the back trails around White Oak better than anyone. By 11, a small force had gathered, ready to ride with Miles to confront Hammond. Elizabeth watched from the window as Miles spoke with them, his natural authority evident in the way the men listened intently to his instructions. She felt a surge of something warm and unfamiliar in her chest. Pride, yes, but also a deeper emotion she wasn't ready to name. Miles found her upstairs, checking her small revolver one last time before tucking it into the pocket of her riding skirt. "You don't have to do this," he said from the doorway, his expression troubled. "There are enough men willing to stand with me now. You can stay here, where it's safe." Elizabeth didn't look up from her preparations. "There's no such thing as safe as long as Hammond draws breath," she replied, securing a knife in her boot as her father had taught her years ago. "Besides, do you think I could sit here, not knowing whether you—" She trailed off, unable to voice the fear that had taken root in her heart. Miles crossed the room in 2 strides, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders as he turned her to face him. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, her name a caress on his lips. "When this is over, when Hammond has paid for what he's done, I want you to know that I—" She pressed her fingers gently to his lips, stopping the words. "Tell me after," she whispered. "When we both come back. Tell me then." He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent heat spiraling through her. For a moment, they stood suspended in time, the world beyond the room fading away. Then the clock in the saloon below struck the half-hour, and reality intruded once more. "It's time," Miles said, reluctantly releasing her. Elizabeth nodded, squaring her shoulders. "Let's finish this," she agreed. Together. The noon sun beat down mercilessly as Miles led the small contingent of townspeople toward White Oak Ranch. Dust rose from beneath their horses' hooves, creating a cloud that would be visible for miles. Hammond would know they were coming long before they arrived. Elizabeth rode beside Miles, her face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, her heart hammering against her ribs. The plan was simple, but dangerous. While Miles and the townsmen confronted Hammond in the main yard, she would slip away to the kitchen entrance, where Sarah would be waiting. Once inside, she would make her way to Hammond's study and retrieve the deed to the Blackwood Ranch from the safe. The success of the plan hinged on Hammond's ego. his certainty that Miles would face him directly, man to man, giving Elizabeth the opportunity to move unnoticed. As they crested the final rise overlooking the ranch, Miles reined his horse to a halt, surveying the scene below. Hammond's men were positioned strategically around the property, rifles glinting in the sunlight. On the wide veranda of the main house stood Hammond himself, flanked by Jensen, sporting a dark bruise on his temple from Miles' pistol, and the ever-present Diaz. "Well," Miles said quietly, "at least we know where everyone stands." The confrontation unfolded much as they had anticipated. Hammond, arrogant in his perceived power, stood on his veranda like a king holding court as Miles and the townspeople rode into the yard. "Blackwood," he called, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "I see you've brought reinforcements. Afraid to face me alone?" Miles dismounted casually, his posture relaxed, even as his eyes catalogued every potential threat. "Not afraid, Hammond," he replied. "Just wanted witnesses when I take back what's mine." Elizabeth used the distraction to slip from her horse, staying in the shadow of the barn as she made her way toward the kitchen entrance at the rear of the house. She could hear Miles continuing to engage Hammond, his voice pitched to carry. "3 years ago, you shot my brother in the back and stole his ranch," he was saying. "I've come for the deed and for justice." Hammond's laughter rang out, cold and dismissive. "Justice? You're nothing but a washed-up lawman with a grudge, Blackwood. Your brother drew on me. Ask anyone who was there." Elizabeth reached the kitchen door, just as the first shouts erupted from the front yard. Sarah was waiting, her dark eyes wide with fear, but her hands steady as she ushered Elizabeth inside. "They're all watching the showdown," she whispered. Hammond's study is clear. The interior of White Oak Ranch was cool and silent, a stark contrast to the tension building in the yard outside. Elizabeth moved swiftly through the servants' corridors, guided by Sarah's whispered directions. The sound of raised voices filtered through the walls, followed by the unmistakable report of a gunshot. Elizabeth froze, her heart in her throat, but Sarah urged her forward. "Keep moving," the cook insisted. "That was just a warning shot. If your man goes down, believe me, you'll know it." They reached Hammond's study without incident, the room exactly as Elizabeth remembered it from her previous visits. Leather-bound books lining the walls, a massive oak desk dominating the center, and behind it, the painting of Hammond's prize stallion concealing the safe. Sarah took up position by the door, while Elizabeth moved to the painting, lifting it carefully from the wall to reveal the iron safe embedded in the plaster. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the dial, following the combination she'd seen Hammond use months before. Right 3 times, left twice, right once. The lock released with a satisfying click, and Elizabeth swung the heavy door open, her breath catching at the sight of the documents inside. Bundles of papers. Land deeds, banknotes, a paper empire built on theft and intimidation. She rifled through them quickly until her fingers closed around a deed bearing the name Blackwood. Outside, the shouting had intensified, and Sarah glanced nervously over her shoulder. "Hurry," she urged. "Something's happening out there." In the yard, the situation had deteriorated rapidly. What had begun as a war of words between Miles and Hammond had escalated when Diaz, acting on some silent signal from his employer, had fired a shot into the ground at Miles' feet. Now Hammond's men and the townspeople faced each other in an uneasy standoff, weapons drawn but not yet fired in anger. Miles stood in the center of it all, his attention fixed on Hammond, even as his peripheral awareness tracked every movement around him. "Show me the deed, Hammond," he demanded. "Prove you came by my brother's ranch legally, and I'll ride away today." Hammond's smile was cold, calculating. "The deed is locked away safe, Blackwood. And even if I had it here, why would I show it to you? You have no authority in this territory." He descended the steps of the veranda slowly, moving to stand directly before Miles. "What you do have," he continued, voice pitched for Miles alone, "is something of mine. Where is Elizabeth?" Miles' expression betrayed nothing, but internally he prayed Elizabeth had found what they needed and was already on her way to the rendezvous point. "My wife isn't your concern," he replied evenly. Hammond's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Wife," he spat. "We both know that's a lie. No judge performed any ceremony. You're trying to steal what's mine, just like I supposedly stole from your brother." His hand moved toward his jacket, where Miles knew he kept a derringer. "The difference is," Hammond continued, "I won't let you get away with it." Elizabeth had just secured the deed inside her bodice when the first volley of gunfire erupted from the yard. Sarah gasped, clutching the doorframe as the sounds of chaos filtered through the house. Shouts, the thunder of hooves, more gunshots. "It started," the cook whispered, fear evident in her voice. "We need to go, now." They abandoned caution, racing back through the servants' corridor toward the kitchen. Halfway there, they rounded a corner and collided with Jensen, the foreman's eyes widening in shock at the sight of Elizabeth inside the house. "What the?" he began, reaching for his gun. Without hesitation, Elizabeth drew her small revolver from her pocket and fired. The shot went wild, but it was enough to make Jensen dive for cover, giving the women precious seconds to sprint past. They burst into the kitchen just as the back door flew open, revealing Diaz, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Hammond wants the woman," he snarled, advancing on them with his pistol drawn. Sarah grabbed a cast iron pan from the stove and swung it with all her might. The heavy implement connected with Diaz's arm with a sickening crack, sending his gun clattering to the floor. Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She snatched up the fallen weapon and fired twice, driving Diaz back through the doorway. "Run!" she shouted to Sarah. "Get to the trees!" Together they fled across the open ground behind the house, bullets kicking up dust at their heels, as Jensen, recovered from his surprise, opened fire from a window. The yard had erupted into chaos the moment Hammond had reached for his concealed weapon. Miles had drawn first, faster than any man had a right to be, his Colt clearing leather in a fluid motion that spoke of years of practice. Hammond froze, the derringer half drawn, as he found himself staring down the barrel of Miles' pistol. Around them, men on both sides had drawn weapons, creating a powder keg that needed only a spark. That spark came in the form of a shot from somewhere near the house, a woman's scream, followed by the distinctive report of a small caliber revolver. Miles' concentration wavered for just a fraction of a second, his thoughts flying to Elizabeth, and Hammond seized the opportunity. The derringer appeared in his hand as if by magic, but before he could aim, Miles fired. The bullet caught Hammond in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to one knee. As if that shot had been a signal, the yard erupted in gunfire. Miles dove for cover behind a water trough as bullets splintered the wood around him. Through the chaos, he caught glimpses of the battle unfolding, Hargrove the blacksmith, firing methodically from behind a wagon. Young Billy from the livery, weaving between buildings on horseback to draw fire away from the others. The widow Cooper, calmly reloading a rifle that looked almost too big for her frame. Elizabeth and Sarah had nearly reached the tree line when a bullet caught Sarah in the leg, sending her sprawling to the ground with a cry of pain. Elizabeth skidded to a halt, turning back despite every instinct screaming at her to keep running. "Go," Sarah gasped, clutching her bleeding thigh. "Get that deed to Blackwood." But Elizabeth couldn't abandon the woman who'd risked everything to help them. She dragged Sarah behind the cover of a woodpile, tearing strips from her petticoat to bind the wound, even as bullets thudded into the logs around them. "We go together," she insisted, helping Sarah to her feet. They stumbled toward the trees, Sarah leaning heavily on Elizabeth's shoulder, when the sound of hoofbeats made them turn. Jensen was bearing down on them, his face contorted with rage as he raised his pistol. Elizabeth brought up Diaz's gun, only to have it click empty in her hand. Time seemed to slow as she watched Jensen's finger tighten on the trigger, certain that her last act would be to shield Sarah with her body. The shot, when it came, didn't hit either woman. Instead, Jensen jerked in the saddle, a look of profound surprise crossing his features before he toppled sideways from his horse. Behind him, mounted on his dappled stallion, sat Miles Blackwood, smoke still curling from the barrel of his Colt. "Elizabeth!" he shouted, spurring his horse toward them. "Are you hurt?" Relief washed over Elizabeth at the sight of Miles, whole and unharmed. "Sarah's been shot," she called back, still supporting the cook's weight. "We need to get her to Dr. Wilson." Miles swung down from his horse in one fluid motion, lifting Sarah into the saddle before turning to Elizabeth. His eyes scanned her for injuries, the intensity of his gaze making her breath catch. "Hammond?" she asked, acutely aware of the deed pressed against her skin beneath her bodice. "Wounded, not dead," Miles replied grimly. "He's holed up in the house with what's left of his men. The townspeople are holding their position, but we need to leave, now." He whistled sharply, and a second horse appeared from the tree line, led by Billy from the livery. "I figured you might need a ride, Miss Elizabeth," the young man said with a gap-toothed grin. Elizabeth mounted quickly, then reached into her bodice to withdraw the folded deed. "I found it," she said, extending the document to Miles. "Your brother's ranch, proof that Hannon forged the transfer." Miles took the paper, his fingers brushing against hers in a touch that felt electric despite the circumstances. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a connection deeper than their hasty alliance. Then the crack of a rifle shot shattered the moment, and Miles was all business once more. "Ride for town," he ordered. "Get Sarah to the doctor. I'll meet you at the saloon when this is finished." The ride back to Redemption Creek was tense, with Elizabeth constantly checking over her shoulder for signs of pursuit. She'd left Miles and the townspeople to finish what they'd started, to ensure Hammond would never again threaten anyone in the valley. Sarah rode before her, pale but conscious, the makeshift bandage on her leg now soaked with blood. By the time they reached Dr. Wilson's small clinic on the edge of town, the cook was barely conscious. The doctor, who had wisely remained behind during the confrontation at White Oak, rushed out to help them. "Gunshot wound," Elizabeth explained breathlessly as they carried Sarah inside. "She saved my life." Wilson nodded grimly, already rolling up his sleeves. "I'll take care of her," he promised. "You'd best get somewhere safe, Elizabeth. Hammond's men in town will have heard the gunfire by now." She knew he was right. The confrontation at White Oak would have repercussions throughout the county. Hammond's reach was long, and even wounded, he remained dangerous. Elizabeth made her way cautiously to the Golden Nugget, slipping in through the back entrance and securing the doors behind her. Only then, in the familiar sanctuary of her father's saloon, did she allow herself to feel the full impact of the day's events. Her hands trembled as she poured herself a whiskey, downing it in one burning swallow before collapsing into a chair to wait for word from White Oak, to wait for Miles. Darkness had fallen by the time the first riders returned to town. Elizabeth, who had been alternating between pacing the floor and watching from the window, rushed downstairs at the sound of horses in the street. Hargrove the blacksmith was the first through the door, his massive frame filling the entrance as he swept his hat from his head. "Miss Elizabeth," he said, his deep voice rumbling with satisfaction. "It's done. Hammond's finished in this valley." Behind him came others, the Widow Cooper, young Billy, men who had stood with Miles against a tyrant. They filed into the saloon, their faces bearing the grime of battle, but their eyes alight with the knowledge that they had, at last, taken back their town. Elizabeth listened to their account with growing pride and relief. Hammond had surrendered when his remaining men abandoned him, fleeing rather than die for a lost cause. The territorial marshal, summoned days earlier by Miles through channels Elizabeth hadn't known existed, had arrived just as the fighting concluded. With him came a federal judge armed with a warrant for Hammond's arrest on charges of murder, land fraud, and a dozen other crimes committed across 3 territories. "Where is Miles?" Elizabeth asked when the initial excitement had died down, her heart constricting at his absence among the returning townspeople. Hargrove exchanged a look with the Widow Cooper before answering. "He stayed behind with the marshal," he said carefully. "There was something he needed to finish." The saloon had emptied out by midnight, the celebration moving to other establishments as the hour grew late. Elizabeth sat alone at a corner table, a cold cup of coffee before her, when the door swung open one last time. Miles stood in the entrance, his tall frame silhouetted against the darkness outside. He looked exhausted, with a day's growth of beard shadowing his jaw and dust from the trail coating his clothes. But his eyes, when they found her across the room, held something she hadn't seen before. Peace, perhaps, or the beginnings of it. He crossed to her table, removing his hat as he approached. "It's over," he said simply, taking the seat across from her. "Hammond's been arrested." The marshal found evidence of other murders at White Oak. Men who'd stood against Hammond over the years, buried in unmarked graves on the property. Elizabeth reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. His fingers were rough with calluses, strong, yet gentle as they closed around her own. "And your brother's ranch?" she asked. Miles smiled, the expression transforming his face, erasing years of hardship and grief. "The deed's been authenticated," he confirmed. "The judge has already signed the papers returning it to me. After 3 years, Thomas can finally rest in peace." They sat in companionable silence for a time, the weight of the day's events settling around them like a blanket. "What will you do now?" Elizabeth finally asked, the question that had been haunting her since morning. Miles studied their joined hands, his thumb tracing small circles on her wrist. "That depends," he said quietly, "on what happens next." She raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. Miles took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for a leap into unknown territory. "This morning, we told the town we were married," he began. It was a necessary lie at the time, but he hesitated, then met her gaze directly. It doesn't have to remain a lie. Elizabeth's heart stuttered in her chest as she realized what he was proposing. Miles Blackwood, she said carefully, are you asking me to marry you? For real this time? A genuine smile spread across his face, reaching his eyes and warming them to the color of honey in sunlight. I suppose I am, he acknowledged. I came to Redemption Creek hunting a killer, looking for vengeance. I never expected to find something worth living for instead. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent warmth spiraling through her. What do you say, Elizabeth? Will you make an honest man of me? Elizabeth felt tears prick behind her eyes, not of sadness, but of a joy so unexpected it almost hurt. 6 months ago, she'd been a woman alone, fighting to keep her father's legacy alive while fending off Hammond's advances. Now she sat across from a man who had faced down death for her, who looked at her not as property to be acquired, but as an equal to be cherished. On one condition, she said, her voice steady, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Miles raised an eyebrow, waiting. White Oak Ranch will be seized by the territorial government, she continued. But your brother's ranch needs someone to run it. I propose a partnership. Your land, my business sense. Together. Miles laughed, the sound rich and genuine in the quiet saloon. A partnership, he repeated, standing and drawing her to her feet. I believe I can agree to those terms, Mrs. Blackwood. He pulled her close, one hand coming up to cup her cheek with infinite tenderness. To new beginnings, he murmured. And then his lips were on hers, sealing their agreement with a kiss that promised more than words ever could. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in the vast western sky, bearing witness to the birth of something precious in a land where second chances were rare and happy endings rarer still. The transformation of a necessary lie into a beautiful truth. The wedding took place 3 days later, a simple ceremony performed by the same federal judge who had presided over Hammond's preliminary hearing. The entire town turned out for the occasion, a saloon overflowing with well-wishers eager to celebrate not only the union of Elizabeth Spencer and Miles Blackwood, but also their own newfound freedom from Hammond's tyranny. Sarah, her leg bandaged but her spirit unbroken, sat in a place of honor near the makeshift altar. Dr. Wilson had declared her recovery a certainty, though she would always walk with a slight limp, a badge of courage she declared she would wear proudly. As Elizabeth and Miles exchanged their vows, a sense of rightness settled over her, as if all the hardships and struggles of the past had been leading inexorably to this moment, to this man. Their eyes met as the judge pronounced them husband and wife, and in Miles' gaze she saw the future unfold. Days of honest work rebuilding his brother's ranch, nights of tenderness and passion, a lifetime of partnership in all things. When he kissed her, the cheers of the townspeople faded away, and for a moment they existed in a world of their own making. A world born of courage and sacrifice and the indomitable human capacity for love even in the harshest of landscapes. Later that night, as they stood together on the porch of the room above the saloon, soon to be their last night there before departing for the Blackwood Ranch, Elizabeth leaned against her husband's solid frame, gazing up at the star-strewn sky. "Did you ever imagine it would end this way?" she asked softly. "When you rode into Redemption Creek, did you think you'd be leaving with a wife instead of just vengeance?" Miles chuckled, the sound reverberating through his chest where her cheek rested. Not for a moment, he admitted. I thought only of justice for Thomas, of making Hammond pay for what he'd done. His arms tightened around her waist, drawing her closer. But life has a way of offering redemption when you least expect it, and sometimes in forms you never imagined. Elizabeth turned in his embrace, rising on tiptoe to press a kiss to the corner of his mouth. Redemption, she echoed with a smile. It seems the town was aptly named after all. Miles captured her lips in a proper kiss then. One that spoke of passion and promise and a future neither had dared hope for just days before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The rebuilding of a ranch, the establishment of a life together, the inevitable struggles of carving a place for themselves in this harsh but beautiful land. But tonight was for celebration, for the joining of two souls who had found in each other the strength to stand against tyranny and the courage to embrace love. And as Miles swept her into his arms to carry her across the threshold into their shared future, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that while he might have married her under the gun, it was love that would bind them for all the days to come. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.